thank you very much. And of course, it's a huge honor to be here giving the Richard Musgrave lecture. Now, I have to just work out how it is I can bring up my slides. Does someone help me with how do I get the menu to appear at the bottom of here? There's a way to make it appear. Ah, there it is. Oh, great. Thank you very much. Excellent. Well, it's on occasions like these, thank you. It's particularly important to pay tribute to CESifo and Hans Werner's achievements in building what is a remarkable institution with, I know, the help and support of Richard Musgrave throughout the period. And I will talk later about the specific influence of Musgrave on my topic today, but I'll leave that for a little while. And thanks also to Robin for his very kind introductory remarks. Robin, I was brought up on Robin's work, so it's particularly pleasurable to think that he would make such kind comments. So I'm calling my lecture today Some Principles of Public Organization. So what's it all about? Well, I suppose I've convinced myself of this through my involvement in policy, that one of the major policy challenges that I see in a number of places where I'm involved, in the UK, but particularly through my work with the World Bank, is the kinds of issues that are currently being faced to improve the quality of policy in public services. And you pretty much, I don't know of any country, and you may tell me that Germany is an exception, I'm not familiar with your debates here, but I know of no country where there are not very central debates about how to improve the performance of public services in different forms, whether, of course, big ticket items in terms of government budgets are things like health and education. And, of course, we as economists are frequently asked to advise, and it's one of the things we hope that we have some capacity to do. And today I'm going to talk about some of the bigger issues that I perceive in this debate and the way it's influencing the progression of public economics, because with an exception that I'll come to later, by and large I would argue that the kind of public economics I was brought up on, which you can roughly speaking say is the public economics in Atkinson and Stiglitz textbook. One of the great joys I had as a graduate student was to work through literally every line of that book. I could reproduce every equation and every argument. I learned pretty much public economics from there. And, but it had very little about the topic I'm going to talk about, very little about public organization. So I'm going to first of all discuss some general issues about reform of public services, and I'm going to talk about some basic principles, and I'm going to try and introduce you to some ways I think some recent work has evolved. So I'm going to begin by saying what I understand by this term public organization. It may or may not be a term you're familiar with. I'll talk about a motivating model, a way of thinking of the issues. I'll talk about some examples, which will be quite exotic in some cases. And I'll talk about some of the core economic elements. In fact, my topic of public organization, I think, actually was in a lot of Musgrave's work. If I go back to the book by him I first read, which was his Theory of Public Finance, a study in public economy in 1959, I would actually argue he, perhaps more than the generation that came after and did public economics, was involved in the study of public organization. In fact, my very first paper in public economics was about something Musgrave had done. It was a paper that was later published in Econometrica with Yrjö Jahnsson called Decentralizing Public Goods Supply. And the point of that paper was to take Musgrave's idea that you need to design government in a way that is most effective. And he had the notion, which I think got a lot of currency at the time, of a division of government into a taxation, a distribution, and a stabilization branch. And that was a sort of study in public organization, the idea you need to think about how you organize and design government. And the particular issue that we wrote about in that paper was the question of when it would be possible, instead of having all public goods decisions made by a single authority at a particular point in time, you could decentralize decisions to different groups and still preserve some kind of optimal allocation of public spending. And this was very much a theme coming out of Musgrave's book. And although I wouldn't have used the term public organization at the time, in effect, I think that early paper was in effect a paper in public organization. So I think in many ways, I hope you'll agree by the end of the talk, this connects very centrally to a theme that I think belonged in Musgrave's vision of public economics. So I view this as a sort of emerging subfield within economics and within public economics. So what is public organization? Well, I define it the following way. I'm sure the definition could be improved upon. It's the organization of the provision of goods and services where social and private returns diverge. In other words, they're things that we care about because we know that individuals taking decisions entirely unilaterally and independently of one another are not necessarily going to get those decisions right. And I'll talk about examples of why we think that there are many such cases later. And I don't think for a public economist who studies these things it's a difficult concept, but I will come to that later. But essentially, we have to think about the question, how do we want to organize a society in order to effectively provide goods and services where social and private returns diverge? And I'll come back to the kinds of issues as we go. It stands somewhere in my sort of view of the world, if you carve up economics into different fields, as we're apt to do when we teach economics, it sort of stands somewhere between what we teach as industrial organization and public economics. And many of the ideas in public organization really come from taking ideas from both of those fields and kind of putting them together. And you'll see what I mean later. It's related to, but it's distinct from the study of political economy, although there are elements of this which I think are centrally issues that we study in political economy, but I do view it as somewhat distinct. There are, of course, existing literatures in public economics that I would view as centrally about what I'm calling public organization. I'm thinking of the literature on fiscal federalism, on TBU competition, on clubs, and on the studies of non-profit. So it's not as if I'm just pulling out of a hat this, but what I'm going to try and convince you, there's a wider set of issues that aren't always tackled. So it's not as if, as I said at the start, that this is all new, but there are many areas. But I want to kind of put a bit of an umbrella on top of it and describe what I think the issues are and the principles are that come on top of this. But these are literatures which certainly connect with the issues that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to now give you 3 concrete examples to think about these issues. They may seem a little bit off the wall, and indeed they probably are for many of you. I'm going to talk about military organization in pre-colonial India. I'm going to talk about schools in Pakistan, and I'm going to talk about universities in the UK as kind of motivating examples to think about the issues that arise. The first one will seem particularly, perhaps, the furthest removed for you, but I've been doing a lot of reading on the history of pre-colonial India recently, and it occurred to me how relevant all the issues I was reading about really were. Actually, I should say, as a graduate student of public economics, the one thing I didn't study at all was military organization. But actually, there's a lot to learn as public economists by studying military organization, I've discovered. So what's relevant, what's interesting about military organization in pre-colonial India? Well, pre-colonial India, which ended in 1857, was essentially a process by which commercial interests were dominant. There was something called the East India Company that was created in order to allow trade between the British Empire and the rest of the world. And of course, the British being the British, and as a commander of the British Empire, I suppose I should uphold this, wanted to make their empire as big and as strong as possible. But they actually ran India until 1857, when there was a major mutiny from which India became firmly a colony, as a kind of offshoot and a kind of essentially a commercially run operation. They didn't want to have a full-scale colonization of India. Now, what was interesting about that was you had the problem of how to secure those commercial activities in the East India Company, and there were big rents at stake. You know, you could make a lot of money, and a lot of people did make huge sums of money out of trading with India at that time. It was rich in many things that were not available in Europe, and by monopolizing trade with India, you could make serious amounts of money. Now, there was traditional colonial rivalry between Britain and France, which spilled over into India. You know, both Britain and France, as the 2 major colonial powers at the time, both had an interest in wanting to to make the most of their commercial interests. And equally, there was a declining power of traditional authority from the Mughal Empire, which had previously been the dominant force in the medieval India. So that was declining. The colonial powers were getting interested, and they wanted essentially to run it like a commercial operation. The tricky issue was, how did you organize or want to organize military power? And there were these sort of almost private entrepreneurs, of which perhaps the most famous was Clive of India, Robert Clive, who organized the armies of the East India Company in the face of the rivalry with France and the rivalry with the existing authorities, and essentially did it on a commercial basis. So the key question was, how do you organize an army? What do you do? How do you find people? Do you bring people in? Do you hire locals? To protect these commercial interests. Should authority be centralized? Should you have a single army, or should you have a series of militias operating in different parts of the area? Should commercial rents be used to motivate the army? Maybe what you should do is just reward them from the activities they did. And actually, Robert Clive, as I understand it from his forays into India, became an immensely wealthy man. He was a general, but in fact he made enormous commercial gains out of the fact that he was running the military operation. So here's an interesting set of issues. I'll come back later to what I think I learned from this, about how do you organize the state. It wasn't really the state at the time, it was a commercial operation, to try and provide the services which were law and order in order to be able to take advantage of these commercial opportunities. And it raised a huge number of issues about how you go about organizing military power in that context. So that's my first example. A second example is much more contemporary, is schools in Pakistan. The major problem of schooling in Pakistan, I would say, is the consistent failure of the public school system. And a lot of debate goes on about how you can take schools, which exist, I mean, everybody can get access to a school in Pakistan, and make it work moderately well. Well, what's happened in Pakistan is actually massive entry of private schools in order to meet the demand side. People have understood, the average Pakistani, I think, has understood very well that this public school system is failing. And as a consequence, they're turning to the private sector. But that's raising all sorts of issues. Should private schools now be offered state funding and support? Should they be regulated? In what form should that regulation take place? Well, here's a picture. It's not going to be that clear to you, but this is an aerial shot from some work by Jishnu Das at the World Bank of what a Pakistan village looks like. And I think that, is this a pointer? Yeah. So what you see here there are two government schools, one here and one here. What are these other things? They're all private schools in this part of Pakistan. And essentially what's happened in recent years is these schools have just come in and basically said, well, these guys are failing, so we're going to come in. They charge fees. They basically set up in people's houses, and they provide an alternative to the state education system. If you it didn't quite work, so I'll do. Okay. So here's a picture of the entry of private schools in Pakistan to show you that this is a serious business. This is going back to 1970, and this is from some work by Andrabi, Das, and Khwaja on the growth of private schools by year of formation. And notice from 1990 onwards, you're getting literally thousands of new schools opening up. And this is entirely private enterprise. These are people just entering up and going into the market, charging people and providing education. And there's an interesting set of issues here that I'll come back to, which I think are at the heart of what I'm calling public organization. Should this be something that we think is great? Is this something that we should be very concerned about? Are there things we should be doing to regulate this? There's all sorts of questions. My final example is universities in the UK. We've long understood, which is kind of good for the policymakers, that universities do two things. They produce research and they teach people. But that raises a lot of issues. How should resources be provided for these two functions? Should you provide just a block grant and let people do teaching and research out of a given grant? Should you have fees? What form of regulation should you have? There's a lot of competition. Universities compete for students and faculty. Is that a good thing? I mean, years ago, there was deliberate efforts made to regulate wages so that universities couldn't compete on the basis of pay, at least, for faculty members. That was an explicit policy of the government that was changed by the Thatcher government in the 1980s, which allowed liberalization of wage structures and allowed people to compete on wages. So what's the best way to organize universities? This is the kind of issue that I want you to think about, and it raises all sorts of questions about the optimal organizational structure. Given that the part of what is produced is a public good, namely research, and part of what is produced is essentially a private good, which is teaching. Maybe there's some public good element to teaching some areas. We want to preserve people with certain types of skills. My colleague Meghnad Desai once pointed out that there was a debate that went on in the 1980s, actually during the Thatcher reforms, which were highly unpopular among universities at the time, about closing down useless subjects. You know, some subjects we could do without. And someone said, oh, there's some guy in some university who's a specialist in medieval Islamic philosophy. I mean, why do we need people in universities to study medieval Islamic philosophy? And the next year, the Shah was kicked out and the Ayatollah came in, and he was hired as a consultant to the British government to tell them exactly what the Ayatollah in Iran stood for, because he was basing a lot of his views on medieval Islamic philosophy. So you have these examples of what should you support, what shouldn't you support, how should you do it, should you incentivize people, how should you design institutions? These are the kinds of issues that interest me. So what are the common elements across all of these examples? We don't expect market prices, if we left this all to the market, to do a very good job at capturing the social returns. I mean, it could have been the case that we allowed the East India Company in India just to get on with it without any government involvement, but actually the British government had a strong interest in thinking that there were lots of externalities associated with what the British East India Company was doing, and it certainly didn't want to leave this to an entirely commercial operation, to a point where, as I say, in 1857, it basically took over the management of India and made it a colony of Britain. There's the need to motivate workers. How do you actually make people do the things you want them to do? And there's a question of how you finance it, the mixture of public and private finance. And do you encourage spontaneous bottom-up activity? A lot of the military activity in pre-colonial India was spontaneous activity. You got people to come and do it because they were being paid to do it, not because the state was telling them to do it. So there's lots of interesting common elements to these examples. Now, what I want to do before I then get into what I think are the substance of what we might do to systematize our knowledge in this area, let me just plant with you three sort of, these are really straw men, so I apologize for that, because I'm sure you'll recognize them as straw men. But what are the sort of standard principles of private organization, of market organization? Well, one is that, generally speaking, we think the profit motive is a pretty important thing. And that's, making people residual claimants is a valuable thing to do. A second is that we think competition, by and large, is extremely valuable, that we prefer to have goods provided competitively than provided by monopolists. And again, we can dream up, we're clever enough as economists to dream up exceptions to these things, but by and large, that's what we believe. And finally, we think that high-powered incentives to be used as motivation, that if you want people to do things, you should pay them to do it, and paying them more in general might make them do them better. Now, of course, we can dream up plenty of exceptions, but I want to plant those ideas because these are kind of principles of market organization that, by and large, with exceptions, we accept. And I want to use public organization to sort of challenge these principles a little bit and think about how we would modify them or change them in our understanding of public organization. So I'll introduce a very sort of little structure, and I apologize to those of you who are not card-carrying economists, but this is going to be my only slightly formal bit of the talk, so bear with me. It's going to be very easy to understand. I'm not going to have lots of equations. But I want to give you a very stylized problem to introduce more concretely. So far I've talked expansively about pre-colonial India and Pakistan. Now I want to go the opposite extreme. I want to go very narrow and describe a really narrow formal problem, and then introduce now public organization more concretely into this problem. So think of the following problem. There's a government or society, government is a representation of society, that cares about some what we'll call quasi-public goods. These are goods that can have some component which is social, but it could be some private. So a lot of the goods we care about are, I would say, quasi-public in the sense there's some non-private motivation. So certain kinds of healthcare and education would be examples. And the problem is to decide who should get some of this good. So who should get an education and who shouldn't get an education? Maybe everyone should, maybe only some people should, these kinds of things. Should everyone get an education going up to tertiary level? These are the kinds of allocation decisions that I want you to think about. And I'm going to characterize that by saying you've got a set of people and you have to decide for each person whether or not you want to give them access to this good. People like this good, they have preferences, and the preferences, people might like it more or less, so there's this preference heterogeneity, and they have these preferences, and they don't get any value from not consuming the good. And it's costly to provide this good. The cost function is C of E, and E is cost-reducing investment. So you can invest and make this a more efficient system of production if you wish. And we'll make simplistic assumptions about the tax system. We'll suppose that the tax system is just lump sum. So you can go around, if you wish to finance this service, you can just go around and finance it from lump sum taxation. Okay, so and what's the actual consumption that people get? They get consumption from their own consumption of the good, but they also get consumption from other people's consumption of the good. So it's so lambda I here is a measure of how much value people get from the aggregate consumption of the good. So it's partially a public good. That's why I call it a quasi-public good. So if you left people to just consume off their own bat, they would ignore this part of their utility. There's also the case that quality matters, that you want people to have high-quality versions of this good. So phi of E is a quality function, which again can be improved. You can invest in better technologies to produce education or healthcare, and that will improve quality. Okay? So those are the core elements. And let's imagine that we have the old-fashioned view of the world, that there's a social planner. There's an individual out there whose job it is to tell society how to do this. And it's got to do three things. It's got to make an allocation decision. Who's going to get educated? Who's going to get healthcare? Who's going to get any of these services? It's got to make a cost efficiency decision. It's got to decide how much to invest in cost reduction. And it's got to make a quality decision. How high a quality should these public services be? And so it's got to make a decision about that. So those three core dimensions of choice are going to be the things I want to focus on. Well, who should get some of this good? Well, essentially, that's straightforward conceptually. You should give this good to people where the private benefit they get plus the social benefit they get is bigger than the cost of providing it. And you should provide this good to everybody. That's anyone who's done any trivial amount of public economics will say this is very obvious, and it is. So really, the key point to observe is if you left it to individuals to make their own decisions about this, they would only look at the private benefits. They wouldn't necessarily look at the social benefits. So leaving it to the market and making people face the true cost wouldn't necessarily get this decision right. Of course, we may not all agree on what the right measure of social benefit is, and political economy models generally look at competing views. I'm going to ignore all that now. I'm going to assume we all agree on what the social benefit is, and therefore we wish to provide goods to people for whom this is true. That's the allocation problem. What about the cost efficiency problem? Well, that's also very straightforward in the world where we have a social planner. You essentially want to invest in cost-reducing effort, which I assume is an opportunity cost of 1, so that if you have a lot of people consuming, you want to invest more in it. So X star is the fraction of people consuming the good, and you want to have an optimal, the marginal benefit of cost reduction equal to the marginal cost. Again, nothing very complicated. You want to have some investment in cost reduction. And what about quality? You want quality improvement to a point where the marginal value of quality improvement, which is essentially the marginal product of quality with respect to E, times the social value of quality is equal to 1. So you want to have investment in quality. So we all want better schools or better hospitals. And this, in principle, should be the equation that tells us how much quality we get. Okay, so that's all. In terms of sitting here or standing here and doing this in the context of a simple model, it's all very simple. We want to run the world so that we give it to the right people, those whose private plus social benefit exceeds the cost. We want to invest in cost reduction to a point where we get the marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost, and we want to invest in quality. So what's the problem of public organization? It's making this happen. How do we actually design a system of decision making so that you can bring about what you want? So clearly, if you had lots of information and you had benevolent bureaucrats and other people around, it would all be rather trivial. You just tell them, go away and do this. That would be, unfortunately, the model that's in a lot of the public economics textbooks for the provision of health and education. In Atkinson and Stiglitz's book, they have a model in which they say, how much education do we want? Well, we'll just give it to the people we want to give it to. There's no issue about cost in their model, and there's no issue about quality in their model. But when I talk to the policymakers, as I do in the UK, I was just on a commission called the 2020 Public Services Commission, the entire debate is about cost and quality. How do we reduce the cost of providing these services, and how do we improve the quality? I didn't find that, or I don't find that, in almost all of the standard models that we write down. So there really is no public organization in the model I've shown you so far. There's just an allocation of resources. Somebody is going to decide how much everyone gets and how to invest. It's really not about the question, which I think is the interesting question, the one begged by all my three examples. How do you design a set of institutions and organizations which actually deliver what you want? How do you actually bring that about? Rather than saying, this is what I want, actually thinking about the problems involved in delivering. Okay? And that's what I think is the key question in public organization. So we want to systematize, what are the principles of public organization then? They're systematizing the body of knowledge relevant to answering concrete policy questions. How do we allocate public, quasi-public goods to the population? Who do we decide should get served and who shouldn't get served with those goods? How do we decide on the level of cost efficiency? How can we improve cost efficiency? And how can we regulate and improve quality? Those are the practical principles of public organization, asking the question, how do we actually deliver? So I'm going to now talk about, for the remainder of my time, I'm going to talk about the key elements as I see them in the emerging literature. I'm going to begin with a bit of a more involved discussion about the nature of public services and how many rabbits there are inside the hat, if you like, in what we've already done. And once you begin to unpack that, you realize in order to even think about the problem, you have to make a lot of assumptions. And I already have made a lot of assumptions. Then I want to talk about three rather concrete economic issues, ones that I think everyone will recognize, and we sort of own as economists. So these are issues we think we know quite a bit about. One is incentives. What's the role of incentives? And do we think differently about incentives applied to public organizations than to private organizations? If so, why? The second about the role of competition. Can we say anything systematic about when competition is a good or bad idea in the provision of public services? And thirdly, about organization design and ownership. Should we have public ownership, private ownership, ownership in trust, which is kind of quasi-public ownership? These are all the issues I want to talk about. So let me talk now about the nature of public services. One side of it is very obvious, and I think it's the side we've always focused on in public economics, and that's the nature of the output that you're producing. I've in a sense already talked about that. The nature of the output of public services is typically that there is some external benefit to having people consume these goods. What are these external benefits? They're things like externalities, namely if they can be public goods or public bads, but we think that having people consume certain goods has benefits to society at large. So the classic problem for many developing countries is getting increased enrollment in primary education, because there's a strong belief that primary education has major external benefits for the economy. So that's the strong motivation behind the Millennium Development Goal for primary education. But other things also enter, issues like equity or minimum service objectives. Maybe you think everyone should have access to a telephone. If you think that, then you can't rely on the market, because if you live, well, maybe now it's true because of mobile telephony, but historically, if you relied on the market to provide telephones to very remote areas of a country, those people wouldn't have been economically viable. So you would have had people who were excluded. So most of our public service organizations have minimum service objectives, which mean they have to provide a viable service to everybody, whatever form that takes. The problem with all of these is they're very, very hard to quantify social returns. These are not things where we think quantitatively we know how to measure these things. In our theoretical models, we just say there's something called social benefit. But actually, when you get involved in real policy and get asked, well, how big are these social benefits? You know, a policymaker will say, what is the size of the externality to primary education? And how much extra public spending does it actually involve? You end up sort of shuffling around looking at your feet and realizing we probably have very, very few papers that give us reliable estimates of the social returns to private education. So these are things that are inherently very hard to measure and very hard to quantify, and yet to do proper policy analysis you need to be able to do that. Indeed, we have a sort of model of how to do this if you could quantify social benefits, and that's what I'll call the Lindahl benchmark. What Lindahl suggested is the best way to organize the provision of public goods was to essentially establish the social values and give them to private firms and then let private firms provide public goods. Why isn't that feasible? That's not feasible principally because it's very hard to contract over that stuff and to measure the stuff that would be involved. You'd have to have very good estimates to be able to actually incentivize private firms to correctly provide public goods. And actually more striking than that, and this has been a huge issue at the World Bank in the public services area, is it's also very, very difficult to do good cost-benefit analysis for many of these projects. Because you'd say, well, okay, if you're going to do it in the public sector, do cost-benefit analysis. But to do cost-benefit analysis, you also need to have good quantitative measures of the value, the social value of the inputs you're creating. And very often we struggle to say, what's the social value of a health clinic, or what's the social value of education? So at a practical level, one of the biggest difficulties in running effective public services is we have very poor quantitative estimates of the value of the outputs that are created. In Britain, we've been doing a lot of work on things like trying to provide evidence of output from public services. We have, for example, universities. Let me give you an example. We have something which is now finished but been replaced called the research assessment exercise. Every 6 or 7 years, the government decides to measure the output of the research of British universities. And it does it by having panels of academics read the research input of all, essentially each university is invited to submit the research output of the academics in that university. They get read and they're graded on quality from 1 to 4. And then on the basis of that, money is given to universities, essentially more money given to higher quality research universities. Now that's an attempt to quantify, I assume, the social value of what universities are producing. Because in order to do that, in order to design funding, you need to do that. Of course, it creates lots of incentives. The first time they ran this exercise, people were poaching faculty at the last minute because they realized that the way they'd structured the exercise, it was only based on who was at the university on the date of the assessment. So people gamed the system and hired people at the last minute because they could include them in it. And then they killed all those incentives at the next round. But this had all sorts of implications. Our heads of department now, we're just going through, because there's going to be another one in 2014. I'm sitting on the panel for the economics panel for 2014. Everybody is going to get a visit from their head of department very soon to ask the question, what research output are you going to produce, or have you produced, for the 2014 Research Excellence Framework Analysis? So these things really matter. These are all attempts to measure benefits and then to use those as an attempt to regulate the sector. So these are non-trivial problems how you actually do it. It's very easy in theory. We can write down a theoretical model in 5 seconds that says, well, what you want to do is you want to do it so that the social benefit is reflected. How do you actually measure it is an enormously complicated and non-trivial exercise. Well, suppose you've got these measures. What actually do, so one thing I want to back up a minute and say, what do public service organizations do? How do we think about that? I think, what we think happens in the private sector, of course we're wrong, but what we think and the way we model it and tell our students to do it is profit maximization. What we think private firms do is to maximize profit. That's their motivation in life. Now, of course, if you go to BP or Shell's website, they don't put in their mission statement. They all have mission statements. They don't put, we aim to maximize profit. They all say, we aim to do our business in an environmentally friendly way. We're nice to people all over the world. So actually, even private sector organizations don't even admit that their main objective in life is private profit maximization. But when you go to public organizations, to universities, schools, hospitals, police forces, whatever your favorite version is, the mission is a way of thinking about what that organization is trying to achieve. And some actually have mission statements. You can actually go to many non-profits or universities and they'll tell you on their website, this is our mission in life. Now, of course, that's a very sort of naive way of thinking about organizations, but it fits in with the public administration literature. So James Q. Wilson has a famous book on bureaucracy from the mid-1980s, or 1990s maybe, I can't quite remember the date, in which he argues that this is a way to think about effective bureaucracy. That he makes a differentiation between bureaucracies which work effectively and those that don't, and he says those that work effectively are those that have developed and are able to implement effective missions. And the literature on non-profit organization and charities also makes a great deal about the importance of mission. So I would argue a key part of trying to understand public service provision is to understand how these missions are determined. Now, one way to do it is you write it down. You just write down your mission and then it's enforced by some external operator. And I'll come to that later. I mean, there are some examples of that where actually there is external enforcement of mission. For example, the LSE could not, where I work, could not decide to become a commercial organization making cars. We would be sued if that happens because we do have a binding legal document that says we exist to provide education. So it limits what we're allowed to do. So it is true that we have a written mission, which is as an educational institution. But who should choose the mission and what scope is there for decentralizing that mission? Should we let schools all have their own mission? So should we have an education system in which every school decides what to teach and how to teach it? That will be a very decentralized system of education, and some countries want to go down that route. They basically say, why should central government be determining curriculum choice in schools? Surely school principals know better than some bureaucrat sitting in the Ministry of Education about what the best needs are for the education of that school. That's like a very decentralized system of missions. So there's a lot of issues, I think, in public sector organization around how you both formulate what the mission is and then how you enforce it and who makes that decision. So that's on the output side. What about on the input side? Well, one, I think, very key component of public organization is that the kinds of people who work in public organizations have very strong non-pecuniary motivation. Now, that may also be true in the private sector. I wager that if you ask people in the financial sector, why do you work in the financial sector, almost none of them will tell you because I make an awful lot of money. They will tell you something, oh, I believe that finance is a hugely important industry that supports the pensions of you people out there, or whatever, but I'm almost sure they wouldn't tell you it's because I'm greedy. So actually in life, most of us rely on non-pecuniary motivations when we describe what we do. And there are various theories of non-pecuniary motivation, intrinsic motivation coming out of psychology, warm glow models in which I get pleasure from doing certain kinds of occupation versus others. Maybe it's ideological. Maybe I feel that the best way I can get over my worldview is to teach kids that worldview. The Marxist critique of state education was that state education was an attempt to brainwash people into believing in capitalism. There are many papers written by Marxists on the critique of public education because education becomes a tool of the ruling class in which it enforces the proletariat to be passive. That's an ideological view of public education. There are many papers on that. Maybe it's corruption. Maybe I like the idea that I only do things because of being able to corrupt in some way. What makes life difficult? And anybody, I'm sure Hans Werner will, as someone who's been a public sector entrepreneur, will appreciate this as anybody who's been involved in management in public organizations, is the great problem is everybody has their own idea of what they really want this organization to do. That's why university management is probably one of the most difficult tasks in the world, because you're left with a number of people, all of whom have their different ideas about how to run the university. That's because they don't care that much about money. They care about their own view being propagated through the organization. So actually public organizations rife with people who have non-pecuniary motivations are much more complicated animals to govern and to regulate and to organize. It'd be much easier if we only all cared about money, because we could just pay people to do what we want them to do. But the fact is very few people care sufficiently about money that works as a way of operating. And that's why selection is so important. In the end, and actually this is a view that's not just a public organization view, it's a more general view. The only way to change an organization is to get more people who buy into the mission. So selection becomes very, very important. So what concrete examples of what, so in my work with Yrjö Jahnsson, we use the term motivated agents to describe this issue, that many people enter organizations and work in organizations because they want to fulfill the mission of that organization. So why am I at LSE rather than some other university? Presumably because I like the way that organization delivers on its mission. Otherwise I go off to some other university which provided a mission that was more conducive to me working in a university context. So missions become a kind of selection mechanism for workers who move between public organizations, and that's the vision we describe. Of course, there's a central interesting question, and I'm not going to have time to go into this in any detail, but there's a kind of overlap here with the organizational psychology literature on, can you really change people's motivation, or is it something that you have to live with? Can you influence the way people think? These are all very important issues. Okay, for the remainder of my talk now, what I want to do is to take these views about outputs and inputs and now apply them to three staple topics: to incentives, competition, and organization design. So let me begin with incentives. So what I want to say, suppose we take my view that there are these features of outputs and these features of inputs. How does it change our view about incentives in the public sector? Well, of course, you may say we should ignore all this stuff and we should just apply standard insights. And in fact, in the 1980s, there was a movement which gets called in the public administration literature the New Public Management. Essentially, the New Public Management was a movement to say we should introduce into the public sector ideas that people thought had been successful in the private sector, which are things like motivating people by paying them. And that we should start, traditionally, public sector organizations had very few incentive mechanisms. Teachers or academics or others rarely were offered incentive pay. After the 1980s, a number of governments started experimenting with incentive mechanisms. And I remember sitting once in a meeting at McKinsey's in London with their public sector advisory group, where they said, yeah, this was a great idea. This was introducing into the public sector something we'd known had failed in the private sector for many years. In fact, very few people believe that the best way to make an organization change is by paying people. What these guys often say, the only way to make an organization change is to get rid of people who don't agree that the organization needs to change. It's not a case of getting the people in the organization and paying them to do things differently. But it actually had a lot of play in the policy debate. And there were, if you go around the world, there were lots of attempts to incentivize public sector workers after the 1980s based on this sort of new public management philosophy. It had a lot of influence. There are teacher incentive programs, healthcare incentive programs. They're all around the world, all emanating from this view. There are lots of reasons to doubt why standard monetary incentives work well when applied to the public sector. And they were probably already well known by people who were doing incentive theory, although actually, interestingly, a lot of these ideas were developed in the 1990s, sometime after these efforts. One is the classic multitasking problem, namely that, okay, suppose some activities you want me to do are well measured, but other activities are poorly measured. You can only incentivize me for the things that you can measure. But the things that I can measure may be a very poor representation of the stuff the organization really does. So think of let's come back to a good example is my research assessment exercise. And I heard people say this, by the way. The research assessment exercise starts to reward people for publishing. Okay? And people say, oh, that's a terrible idea. Because actually what academics do is much more important than publishing. They sit around being nice to students, they develop ideas, and why should we have them publish those ideas? That's only for people who really want to show off. It's enough for them to have time to just sit around and debate the issues. We'll ruin our universities if we actually start incentivizing people to publish. And it's true, actually, if you look at, there's a very nice analysis I just saw in Britain on British publications per capita before and after the research assessment exercise was introduced and compared to other countries, and you can guess what happened. Basically, people just started publishing a whole lot more. Now, you may think that made all of our universities much worse. I don't know. But some people say that's a classic multitasking problem. Multiple principles. Another problem is often there's many people in the public sector who have an opportunity to incentivize you. You don't have a single principal. And of course, they may be able to incentivize you in money or not with money, but let me think of a classic school incentives problem. You want to be nice to the parents, you want to be nice to the school principal, you want to be nice to various people. There's all these principals who in principle are trying to influence your action. And it can be very complicated. This is really a non sequitur, but I'll tell you a good story. So one big idea, of course, is parent power in running schools. The main problem with schools is we haven't given parents enough input. And there was a wonderful example I heard about in Bolivia, where they said, well, okay, we'll respond to this. What we'll do is we'll give an increment of the school budget to the parents and let the parents choose how to invest that increment of school budget. And it turned out what was top of the parents' list in Bolivia? Having the best football coach in the area. Now, maybe actually in a very poor area of Bolivia that wasn't so irrational, because the way out of poverty was to become a professional footballer. But there's a question, that's some classic multiple principles problem. You've got different people with competing interests, and you allow them all some say in the organization, and that's very complicated. Another idea is intrinsic motivation. Maybe you crowd out motivation by paying for stuff. And again, people have argued that. Bruno Frey in particular has a very nice book, actually. If you've never read it, I recommend it, called Not Just for the Money, an analysis of motivational crowding. And he has a wonderful example, again, it's not quite fitting in, but I'll tell you anyway, because it's a great example in the beginning of his book, where he said, imagine that you invited some friends over to dinner, and you spent a whole afternoon before they come over to dinner slaving in the kitchen to produce a wonderful meal so that they'd enjoy it. And suppose, so they eat the meal and they enjoy it. And suppose at the end of that, one of your guests stood up and said, that was such a great meal, I'm going to give you $100 for producing that meal. The question is, if you'd known in advance they were going to give you that $100, would you A, have produced an even better meal, or B, poisoned them? Anyway, monetary incentives sometimes a double-edged sword. Okay. Of course, multitasking, a very good example of the multitasking has been to teacher incentives. There's been lots of programs tried around the world to incentivize teachers to try and get better exam scores. And they work, by and large. I think the evidence, if you look around the world, is that these schemes work. Teachers do produce more exam scores when you pay them to. Of course, the teacher unions hate these things in both ways. In Britain, the teacher unions opposed, or did oppose, hand over fist any of these measures. And they hate them even more when they work, because, of course, they oppose them on the basis, we're professionals, we don't need incentives, we do the right thing regardless of what you do. So it was the sort of double whammy. Not only did they work, but second of all, the unions opposed them. Anyway, there's a lot of evidence they actually work, overwhelming evidence they work, but the problem is, at what price? In particular, if you're rational, as has been pointed out, you'll focus on kids very close to passing the test. So a lot of resources go in ignoring the kids who are going to pass anyway, ignoring the kids who are going to fail anyway, and just concentrating all your attention. So there are lots of these issues around multitasking. Okay, I'm going to skip this because I want to talk about this. I'd love to talk about this, but I'm not going to. Okay, let me talk next about competition. Competition is, again, something that a lot of people have got very excited about introducing into the public sector, and we can think of our own favorite example, a lot of them in schooling, for example, where a number of countries have introduced schemes explicitly targeted at trying to increase competition in the education sector. Now, in Pakistan, you saw the form it took. It took the form of entry of for-profit private schools. In Sweden, it takes the form of entry of state-funded schools. There is a system in place in Sweden where parents can start up a new school, get public funding, and this has been taken advantage of by many parents. So there are lots of schemes out there. In Britain right now, we're trying to encourage competition in the health sector by having entry for some kinds of private health providers to provide certain kinds of operations and treatments. These are the kinds of measures now that are being widely discussed. So the question of whether you liberalize entry, you allow more competition, whether you have, in general, more decentralized decision-making to compete or not, or whether you contract out services. And of course, many of our public organizations were the product of, historically, private entry. So my own institution, the LSE, was founded as a private foundation by, among others, George Bernard Shaw, who was actually our first Nobel laureate. The novelist George Bernard Shaw was one of the founders of LSE, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1921. They basically said there's not enough education. Their idea was, their mission, their motivation was to provide education to people who couldn't afford it and wanted to come in the evening. So LSE actually was a kind of evening school back in those days to provide training in economics and political science and public administration to people who couldn't afford to go to regular universities. But my point is, that was a process of entry. In that point in British history, anyone could set up a university. They could just set one up in the evenings, and we've kind of lost touch with that now. I don't know when the last entry of a British university was, some time ago, and it certainly wasn't spontaneous private action. It was probably the University of Buckingham, which was founded, I think, in the 1970s, again on the basis of dissatisfaction with the public scheme. So there are lots of debates. Should you liberalize entry? Should you make it easier to have new public organizations, schools, hospitals, whatever, or should you just, in a sense, restrict entry? Very important question. Well, what are the roles of competition that you might want to take advantage of? Well, I think they're fairly obvious to economists, but people have suspicion about these in all areas of the public sector. One is the allocative role, the other is efficiency enhancing role, and the third is the quality improvement and innovation role. All of which are the kinds of things where in the private sector we think entry and competition are very valuable. But there's reasons to be somewhat suspicious in the context of public services. It's not to say you shouldn't have competition, but there are certainly downsides as well as upsides, and this is one of the big issues. The basic motivation for competition in public services is the motivation for competition in anything. People should get what they want. They should be allowed to shop around and get more of what they like. One way to think about this is organizations could compete on missions. If I want my child to be educated in a very formal school that does Latin and maths and Greek or whatever, I should be allowed to do that. That's my right. I mean, I should just be able to send my child to, and maybe the process of competition and entry, much as I can have any kind of mobile phone I want, I should be able to have any kind of education I want, provided the market's willing to provide it. And arguably, the proponents of these ideas say entry and exit allows variety to flourish and allows matching between parents and their needs. One idea, of course, that's always been out there for a long time is the role of vouchers and the creation of voucher systems. And in fact, if you look at the Swedish model, it's a kind of voucher system by a different name. Essentially, it does allow parents to travel with public funding. And we have a new system in the UK now, which is essentially a voucher system to allow parents to set up new academies. But they also get business sponsorship to co-sponsor academies. So it's a combination of a partnership with local business and with public money. So these are the kinds of ideas. Now, of course, one of the concerns is that all the rich kids will end up in the same school. But there are ways of doing that. If you care about that, there are ways of pricing externalities. The value of the voucher could vary with the composition of the students. And we have something in the UK called a pupil premium, which means the more kids you teach from disadvantaged backgrounds, the better the value of the public funding. So you can offset some of those externalities by changing the system. These are all the kinds of issues that are under debate. Cost efficiency. Does allowing price competition enhance cost efficiency? Well, there's one issue there. The answer is, of course, probably it does. But the one question people ask is, are consumers very good judges of quality? So a lot of the pushback on allowing competition to reduce cost efficiency is that consumers will not observe the right dimensions of quality. An example would be in the area of cost efficiency in health. You don't actually know when you show up at a private health facility what cost-cutting measures have been taken. But if something goes wrong in the middle of your medical treatment, you sure as hell care about what cost-cutting measures have been undertaken. So there are lots of issues about whether the cost-quality trade-off is unfavorable. Another interesting issue, which I think is absolutely the heart of these questions, is liquidation threats. One of the reasons why we think private business is so responsive in cost terms is because basically they'll go out of business. We're very loath as societies to liquidate public organizations. Now, we're going to face an issue in Britain very soon about universities. With our new funding regime, I conjecture that one or more universities will become unviable. Will the government sit by and let a university become bankrupt? We don't know. There's really important and interesting questions about whether public service organizations should be protected from bankruptcy or allowed to go bankrupt. But historically, there's been very little bankruptcy in public organizations. Maybe that explains why cost inefficiency is so rife, because we don't subject public organizations to the same kinds of threats of bankruptcy that you'd get in commonplace in private organizations. Another issue is innovation. How do you think about innovation in the context of public goods and public organizations? What creates incentives to innovate? And are there good incentives for innovative activity once the profit motive is absent? And then another central issue. Okay, let me finally, in my last few minutes, talk about organization design, which is the third wing of the topic. What do I mean by organization design? I mean the sort of law and economics of public organization. So what is the constitution of an organization? What's its legal status? There's a couple of ways to think about it. One is the allocation of residual claims, and I'll talk about what I mean by that in a minute. And the other is the allocation of residual control rights or ownership. Ownership is something that excites people a lot, at least in my country, in the context of public organization. The idea that you turn something from being publicly owned to privately owned, or vice versa, gets people very excited. But actually, I don't know whether the LSE is publicly owned or privately owned. I really don't know. We get public funding, but we're a private trust, essentially set up by George Bernard Shaw and the Webbs in 1895. We're not a publicly owned body, but to all intents and purposes, we are a public organization. But people still get very hot under the collar when they think about the ownership structures behind this. What are the three important ideas in public service organizations that I think have not been fully analyzed or understood? One is the importance of ownership in trust. Most property run or owned by public organizations, if they're not pure stand-up for profits, is owned in trust by some form. So property is not, LSE doesn't have shareholders. Most public organizations don't have shareholders. Their property is held in trust by boards of trustees who bear responsibility for administering on behalf, the assets on behalf of those organizations. Another important idea is what's called ultra vires, which is a common law concept called definite objective. What you do is you lay down what the authorities and powers of organizations are. So the reason why the LSE could not become a car company is because it would be ultra vires. We would be sued in a court of law because our mission and our legal statute says we are an educational organization. Most public organizations do pursue a definite objective, which they are forced to lay down in law. And a third idea, which again will be familiar to many of you, is the non-distribution constraint. You're not allowed to distribute the surplus created by such an organization to external members. You can't, for example, have shareholders. And that's the classic idea behind a non-profit organization, that you operate under a non-distribution constraint. So those are the three core ideas under organization design. Of course, the non-distribution constraint or not-for-profit status has been much discussed, but there's no reason on earth to think that just by endowing an organization with a not-for-profit objective, you guarantee that it operates in the public interest. Not-for-profit status is something that you can claim, but you have to then establish a public benefit test on top of that. And then there's also a question of whether by granting not-for-profit status that weakens incentives for innovation, it weakens incentives for cost efficiency. What about if you have competition between non-profits and for-profits? Does that help to alleviate that? These are all the kinds of issues that we don't yet, I think, fully understand. Ultra-vires. Why should we have organizations whose objectives are written down and enforced? Surely it's better to have entirely flexible organizations that can choose what they do on an ongoing basis. So there's a lot of interesting questions about how tightly we want organizations to specify missions or not, as the case may be. And this, again, a very interesting type of issue. And then finally, ownership. Does it matter whether the assets are publicly or privately owned? Again, as I say, people get very hot under the collar about this question. You can write down models. I have a paper, again with Yrjö Jahnsson in the QJE called Public versus Private Ownership of Public Goods, where we apply the Grossman-Hartmore framework to public goods and point out that you get different ownership implications out of public goods than you get out of private goods. So again, that's another dimension of this type of debate. Okay, so I apologize, I speeded up at the end, but I just want to now kind of pull it together. What I've been trying to argue this evening in the lecture is that we need to have better developed and a more systematic body of knowledge around the principles of public organization. I probably asked far more questions than I provided answers, though I'd like to think I could have provided more answers than I've had time to offer now. And I am very mindful of the possibility over the summer I'm going to begin to write a book on this topic, because I just feel that we haven't systematized anywhere this body of knowledge. If we have, please save me the effort by coming and telling me afterwards where it has been systematized. Really, though, it's about standard ideas in economics applied to contexts where the nature of outputs and inputs are different. I think the fact that the nature of outputs are different is perhaps better understood than the nature of the inputs being different. But I really do believe that the nature of inputs being different is an important differentiation between public and private organizations too. And there's quite a lot of evidence on that. It's not something I pulled out of nowhere, that people who work in public organizations that have some mission other than standard private good production, tend to have different social objectives, and that's why they work in those organizations. Introspect, why do you work in a university? If you do, it's probably because you have a different motivation about what you want to do in life than you would if you were working in a car factory. But I would argue that this is still a relatively neglected area in theoretical public economics. I mean, we do have models and we do have a growing body of knowledge, but it's not really properly brought together. And I think perhaps what's the clincher for me is now I spend a fair bit of time, it's a virtue of being in London in our policy capital, talking to policymakers about issues. And a lot of the issues they're talking about are the ones I've raised. How do we redesign our education system to do better for our kids? Should we have more competition? Should we incentivize school principals? Should we change the legal structures to make them do things more in line with what the central administration is saying? These are the kind of issues that are being debated by policymakers. And so we as public economists, I think, need to make sure that we fully systematize the body of knowledge that makes us useful to policymakers. And of course, any specific policy context is going to be exactly that, specific and about that context. Well, as a final comment, let me say there's that famous quote which I love. I think it's due to Bob Solow, which was, he said of Milton Friedman, whenever Milton Friedman sees anything, he thinks about the money supply. Whenever I see anything, I think of sex, but at least I don't put it in my papers. Well, my final comment is, once you start looking, you see public organization everywhere. Let me give you 3 examples. Finance after the financial crisis. Fundamentally, we have come to see all the externalities in private finance. We have come to see the fact that a large part of what finance does is a public service. One of the reasons we had to rescue our banks is because we knew there was this enormous externality associated with the payment system and with people having access to finance. This is a tricky problem in public organization, and people are even talking about having public service banks, which are not for profit, operating to make sure we don't have to bail them out. Now, people from Germany, of course, will say that that's not been a successful example here with the Landesbanker, which I guess are an example of that. But there are lots of interesting questions. What's the right organizational structure for the delivery of finance? And I would say that's become, since the financial crisis, a study in public organization. Another area where these ideas are very important is understanding terrorism and insurgency. Terrorist organizations are public organizations. They don't exist to make profit. They exist to further certain aims, the missions of those organizations. How do they go about doing it? What kind of incentive mechanisms do they use? How do they motivate people? What's their mode of organization? Are they centralized or decentralized? These are central issues in understanding terrorism and insurgency. You look in Libya now, think about the rebels in Libya. How do we think about their organization? How are they actually organizing themselves to be an effective fighting force to try and get rid of Gaddafi? And finally, closer to home, what about the economics profession? One thing is certainly true, and I don't know whether you've experienced this, I have a great deal, going around giving lectures, people telling us that we're responsible for the financial crisis. We economists, what were we up to? Why didn't we have the right incentives ourselves to be spotting the problems? Why weren't people listening to us? Was it because the journals are monopolized by a few places? Is it because we have very poor incentives to work on real-world issues and we all spend our time working on theoretical problems because that's what our incentives say as academics? Is the economics profession optimally organized to deliver the social benefits that we hope the economics profession can deliver? That's a problem, in my view, in public organization. It's about incentives, organization design, and competition is one of the problems. We have insufficient competition. People often tell me the journals are far too monopolized by the right people. How do you encourage competition? So I would argue, once you start looking, there's very little out there that doesn't look like it needs an analysis of public organization. And while I'll have disappointed you, I'm sure, by not offering you perhaps as clear a set of fundamental and laid out clear principles, I hope at least I've been able to convey to you that there are just an enormous number of important issues here crying out for economic analysis. While we may have all the building blocks we need, we've yet to systematically, I think, put them together to answer all of these outstanding questions. Thank you very much.